All right. So yeah, the title of the talk is given. Let me change my formatting here. Yep. So my introduction is given here. So we'll proceed. All right. So the overall kind of flow of this talk that I'm planning here is that are you seeing this sidebar on the right hand side, or is that invisible to you? I guess it's invisible to you. Okay, great. Yeah, so the overall flow of this is we're going to have these basic four sections. So I always start with some basic biography about myself, and then I kind of divided the rest of it into three talks, what I call path to professorship, faculty job application, and discussions after you get your first faculty job. And my goal here is to take a more relaxed conversational approach. So we don't necessarily need to wait until the absolute end to ask questions or anything like that. Um, because there are, multiple sections, maybe we would like ask questions at the end of each section or something to that nature would be, most appropriate. Yeah, and like was said here, you can put something in the chat. It's a bit harder for me to see the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask when you have any questions or concerns, that type of thing. All right, so I'll just continue here. Speaker biography. So yeah, this is me, John Palmore Jr., PhD. I'm also an EIT, if you know what that means. So that's part of the path towards being a licensed registered professional engineer, although most academics don't really go through that process, but I am an EIT. I'm from Alabama, Mobile specifically. Um, Although I'm a professor in mechanical engineering, I majored in aerospace engineering actually for all of my degrees. So aerospace and mechanical are very closely related majors. And so this is my background in terms of that. Undergraduate at Alabama, master and PhD from Cornell University. And then appointments. After my PhD, I basically immediately started as a professor, and I'll have some notes about that as well in this talk. And while I was a professor here, I did a couple of other things, including this summer faculty fellow at the Air Force Research Laboratory. And I'm currently the PI of this research group, the Combustion Atomization and Multi-Phase Physics Research and Education Group. And I keep changing what the acronym stands. Oh, someone else is also from Mobile. That's very neat. I keep changing what the acronym stands for over time, but overall it spells out campfire, which I think is a fun little acronym. So this is a relatively recent image of my PhD research team or my graduate research team. So current personnel, I'm having Karen, Yushu, Saeed. Most of these people are here. So Karen, I think you can see the mouse, right? Karen is this guy. Yushu is this guy. Saeed actually isn't on this image. This was taken before he joined the group. Edwin is this guy. Florian is this guy. I'm obviously this guy. And the one in the center, Meha, actually just finished her PhD and is working at a company in Colorado. So we're really excited about that. And some other past personnel that we've had working with our group are also listed here. Okay, so this is a really long description of my research area, but basically, I do research in an area called multi-phase fluid flows. So that's fluid flows involving two states of matter, for example, liquid and gas. So that's like droplets, bubbles, or solid particles inside of a gas. So that would be like dust particles inside of air, those type of things. And we do them for various applications that are related to aerospace engineering mostly. And my approach is computational. So I do computational research and theoretical research. And I also have a lot of emphasis on the education. So I publish papers or conferences, attend conferences in education. And below is a menu of some of the recent projects that we've worked on. All right, so here are some cool images I thought from some of our recent projects. So this is just a velocity field from one of our configurations where we were looking at dust dynamics inside of sand, which is relevant to aviation engines who might operate airplanes in dusty environments. These top images on the right are both related to fuel combustion. So the fuel is a liquid, it evaporates, the vapor mixes with the air, and that's what undergoes combustion. So just showing some of our capabilities of, in this case, tracking the vapor for around droplets and around liquid jets. And the bottom images here are showing some of the work that we've been doing with looking at like the aerodynamics of droplets and trying to understand how that affects things like the drag and the evaporation. So those were some of our research directions. That was really it for my biography session. So I'm guessing you probably don't have very many questions about that. Um, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but probably we'll just go on to the next section with this path to professorship. All right. So here's just a traditional, typical academic trajectory. So your grad student, that process typically takes maybe 4 to 6 years for a lot of people for your PhD program. And then you would go into something like a postdoc, which might be at a government laboratory, which might be at an industrial company. And then from there, you would kind of go into the next area, which would be all the different types of professor. And there are different types of professor. There's the traditional tenure track professor, which is the central area here. That's stereotypically what people think about when they think professor. There's also different tracks of professor. There's teaching professor, which has similar breakdown compared to tenure track, and there's research professor, which has similar breakdown compared to tenure track. Teaching professor is focused more on teaching. Research professor is focused more on research. Tenure track professors do some of everything. So some of these positions are more interesting or exciting to different people depending on what their specialization is. But most people generally prefer the mainline tenure track professor over the alternatives. So that's kind of the mode that I'm thinking about also when I'm giving this discussion, is thinking about like tenure track professors. Okay. And yeah, so this is the typical path. So 4 to 6 years grad student, 1 to 3, or maybe even more years of postdoc, 4 to 10 years as an assistant professor, 4+ years as an associate, and then you would promote to professor, which is oftentimes called full professor. Usually, if you're doing more than about 5 years as assistant professor, that kind of indicates that you changed universities. So usually it's about 5 years for the process, but it's very common for a faculty to change universities and go to a different university, in which case you will take a bit longer, but just because you're basically you have to do your assistant professor at that second university. All right. And then this path is, not um, concrete exactly. It's not exactly cut in stone. For example, there are plenty of people that I know of who worked in government lab or industry for several years. And instead of going to be an assistant professor, they immediately started off as associate professor. I even know a few people who worked in government lab for very long, maybe like 20 years, and then afterwards they immediately started as a full professor. So, this is not in any way a uniform track, but in general, I'm going to talk about it from the framework as if it were uniform, that it's grad student, postdoc, assistant professor, that type of thing. All right. So I assume that most of you are already in the PhD, maybe some of your postdocs. And so I'm kind of setting this up as an idea of how do you do a postdoc and prepare for becoming a professor. That's kind of the framing that I have here. And one of the things I want to say is, in my mind, there are like 3 types of postdocs. This isn't anything about the quality of the postdocs. This is more about like how do you find out about these postdocs? So, and the way that you find out about these, depending on which of the 3 types there are, right? So I would say that one of the main types is a fellowship, which usually happens at a large government lab. Another one I'll call regularly offered positions, which also usually happens at large government labs, and spontaneous positions. So a fellowship is something that like um, you would apply for it, similar to like if you've ever done National Science Foundation's GRFP or those type of things. So they have this contest every year. It's open for everyone to apply to, or generally open for everyone to apply to. It has the same deadlines every year. And at the end, you get an award, which is a certain amount of money, maybe some um, research support. And the process is the same every year. And usually you are actually get to call yourself a fellow. So you get some type of title to go with it as well. So that's the fellowship track. So searching for those is pretty straightforward in the sense that um, those are always offered. the same way every year. So the process for searching for them and identifying them and preparing your application is pretty straightforward. You can even start doing it now because it's not going to change very much over the course of however many years. So the next one I called was the regularly offered positions. So this is something where um, it's these positions are offered kind of on an as need basis, you could say. But for very large labs, they have these positions on an as need basis basically every year. And so this is the type of thing where they might even have a website that you could go to and look for all of the opportunities to learn about, yeah, this is a postdoc this year, whereas next year the opportunity might be different. And this is usually, like I was saying, occurring at large government laboratories, thinking about like Department of Energy, Air Force, those type of things. And then the other one, which I think is the most common actually, is what I'm calling a spontaneous position. This is usually when an individual faculty at a university just gets a grant, and then they're like, I have a grant, I want to hire a postdoc now. So these are the hardest to find um, because they're not offered in any type of regular manner. So there's not necessarily any place that you can just regularly check to see these opportunities, or there's no regular time frame for which you to check to see the opportunities. You just have to kind of follow up. So you have to inquire with people who you think would be a good fit for doing a postdoc if there are opportunities. Get your PhD advisor to ask around for you, or ask your PhD advisor to ask around for you, and try to meet people at conferences and other opportunities and ask them, you know, are you having postdocs available? That type of thing. So that's how you deal with the spontaneous postdoc opportunities. And in terms of the practical aspect of searching for them, there are a lot of databases for this. But again, especially with the spontaneous opportunities, as I call them, it might be a bit hard to find them. But databases, you can look at your professional organizations, right? Aerospace, chemical, civil, education, mechanical, electrical, applied math, whichever organizations you're involved with. Look in your research journals. You can check LinkedIn. Surprisingly, has a lot of opportunities. The Chronicle of Higher Education and other kind of publications and journals that focus on higher education in general, even though they're not necessarily in your field, oftentimes has a lot of opportunities for you to find jobs. And you can find some on university websites. A lot of universities now have a centralized database of open jobs. For example, that link that I gave there is the centralized database of open jobs at Virginia Tech. Um, yeah, and then the other thing that I said here is keep track of the timeline. So again, especially for the spontaneous positions, you might not really find out about them until fairly close to when they're due. So for the ones that are regularly occurring, you pretty much know when they're going to regularly occur based on previous years. But for the spontaneous ones, you might not find out about it until very close to when it's due. So that's kind of the advantage of inquiring and talking to people in advance, is that you might end up finding out about a position like early, right? Like there's some lag between the time when the position is, uh, you know, let's say thought about, to the process of formalizing the position, writing the job description, finding a place to advertise, paying for the advertisement actually appears on the website, et cetera, et cetera. So you can learn about the position a bit earlier, maybe, if you're inquiring about it that way, and give you more time to prepare a better application. And then when you're looking for postdocs, these are the things that I think that you should use to evaluate this postdoctoral position, thinking about becoming a faculty member. So these are numbered basically in the order that I think that they are important. So different people will have different ideas, but this is generally what I think. You should think about skill development. So what are some skills that you're actually going to learn, either new skills that were going to be complementary to what you did during your PhD, or what are you going to do to deepen your existing skills that you have and demonstrate more expertise in them? So that would be the number one. Network development. So you know, um, it's good to have a wider network, knowing more people that'll just generally let you be abreast of more opportunities to know what's going on the field. So one aspect of it is if you do a postdoc with someone who's well connected, then that can bring you more opportunities because of your connection with that well connected person. Alternatively, you might want to do a postdoc with someone who has a different academic lineage than your PhD advisor, um, right? So that they would have a different network than your PhD advisor, a network that's complementary to your PhD advisor. And in that way, you're widening your network. Mentoring style is also very important. Like, how does this person actually work with students and postdocs? Like, what's their style in terms of like how tightly they will manage or how loosely they will manage, and what type of style that you like. Um, Pessimistically, unfortunately, I could even say that to a certain degree, sometimes some advisors are not very good, and I have heard horror stories of people doing a PhD or doing a postdoc with a certain advisor, and then basically quitting the field because of that PhD or postdoc advisor. So I would put that in the mentoring style category as well. So definitely try to understand the mentoring style. So I placed that as number three instead of number one, for the reason that compared to a PhD, a postdoc is very quick, 1 to 3 years, et cetera, et cetera. So even if you don't like someone's mentoring style, maybe you could tolerate it for a year, maybe not. It depends on how um, discongruent that person's style is with your style, right? But it's definitely something that is very important to think about. Number four was longevity. So that just means how long the position is, whether it's 1 year, 3 years, that type of thing. How much funding support do you have to actually do the position? That's basically just going to determine how much time you have to develop more skills, develop your network, et cetera, et cetera. Location could be important, but not super important because again, it's a temporary. So that's why I put it fifth. And then pays and benefits are also important things. Um, but I mean, if you're doing a postdoc instead of like trying to directly get a job in the industry or something, I'm kind of assuming that pay and benefit is always important. But I'm kind of assuming that it's not the most important thing to you. Right? So those were kind of what I thought were the ideas for evaluating it. And then I did want to talk about this type of thing as well, which I'm calling PhD to faculty programs. So the usual process is to apply to faculty jobs after postdoc. And the reason is because as a PhD student, you're obviously not going to be competitive with people who already have 2, 3, 4 more years of experience than you. So it just makes sense. But there are two types of special programs that do allow you to go directly from PhD to faculty. They're usually targeted towards underrepresented groups. I subdivided those into two categories, like direct PhD to faculty program, and like Virginia Tech has a program similar to that. And there's another style of it where you do a kind of a postdoc or visiting assistant professor type of position. And then after a certain number of years, they basically convert you into a tenure track professor. And the website that I gave here has each of those has that type of program. Yeah, so both of those are available um, options. So what I would say from my experience is that I think doing a postdoc will make you more competitive and ready to get a jump started and be successful in your program. So I would actually recommend that if you do a program like Virginia Tech's program, you're doing it while you're already in your postdoc to sign up for it, rather than just going directly from your PhD. You'll, from experience, I think you might feel a bit underprepared. All right, that was it for that section. Like just talking about the pathways, the pipelines. So were there any like questions specifically about that or that type of thing? I'll just wait a second.
Hi, can you hear me?
I hear someone.
Yes. I have a question. So you just mentioned that I'm just assuming that you did a direct PhD to a faculty position, and you
I
said that
did.
you felt like underprepared. Can you elaborate a little bit of why you felt that way?
Yeah. Well, I think it's just that, so other people who had postdocs, they just had 2 or 3 years more experience than I had. And I'll talk a bit more about some of the CV items associated with being a faculty. And they had more success in those CV items. So I was kind of like trying to do the postdoc while I was a faculty in some sense, which is obviously harder than just doing them separately, if that makes sense. Yeah.
We also have a question on the chat on what is the expected salary for postdoc, the salary range, to know what to look for and what to be considered an outlier.
Yeah, that's a good question. So a lot of universities and also government laboratories have their salaries basically posted, so you can just look them up on the website for that individual university. The other thing that you can look at is the National Institutes of Health (NIH). They regularly post like a certain list that they consider to be like this is the minimum salary, this is grade one, grade two, grade three, etc for postdocs. So you should probably expect to see at least the NIH minimum for your postdoc. But various universities or various organizations, for example, in like San Francisco or someplace like that, they might charge or not charge more. They might pay a bit more to account for this for the cost of living. And I don't know what the number is off the top of my head. Seems like the first link is for only U.S. citizens and green. Are there any other opportunities? Um, is it when you say the first link, are you referring to this direct PhD to faculty program? Which first link are you talking about? Okay, yeah. So that is an issue. So I can't speak universally across everything, but most of those opportunities that I'm aware of, like this, are for like US based people, basically increasing the um, representation of these underrepresented US based groups. Yeah, okay. Is there any other questions about kind of this section? Okay, I'll give a minute or so. But do you recommend to do the postdoc in different labs if I end up staying in the same university? Yeah, that's a really good question. So I would say take it back to that. Oops, take it back to this slide about whether you should do the postdoc with a different lab if you stay in the same university. How do you maximize these type of things, particularly 1, 2, right? So if you can work in the same lab and develop a lot of new skills in that lab, then that's great. If you can work in a different lab and develop a much deeper network, then that's great, right? So I think really it just depends on this was my way of emphasizing those numbers, but you have to make your own way of emphasizing those numbers. So it really just depends on how you want to emphasize those various categories. Okay. Did you do in a different lab? Okay, that's another question. Did I do it in a good lab? Yeah, that's a good question. So I was hired in one of these direct PhD to faculty programs. So I did technically do a postdoc. It was after I had already been hired, and it was in the same lab. It was only for about a month, so it was really just kind of like a stopgap opportunity to do something in between positions. I wouldn't really consider it a postdoc, even though I did do one. And it was with my same person who was my PhD advisor. But again, that was after I had already, signed the job here, that type of thing. So it was somewhat irrelevant for, my placement as a faculty. Okay, so I'll go forward. All right, so the actual application. So these are the general contents of the application. One of the first most important parts is the CV, that's curriculum vitae. And these are the key aspects of the CV in my mind. So these are not in any particular order, by the way. So your peer-reviewed journal publications, conference publications and presentations, any fellowships you have from graduate school or from postdocs, any academic awards that you have, best paper, outstanding new student in research, et cetera, et cetera. Generally, your academic pedigree, people really care a lot, like which university you went to, who your advisor was, that type of thing. History of research support in cash or in kind, and grants funding networks. So these last 2 points, especially, are aspects where you probably don't have this as a grad student, but after you do your postdoc, these are things that you will be more likely to actually have success in. So I think most of these are pretty straightforward. In terms of the history of research support, what I mean here is that when you are a faculty, one of the things that you'll have to do is like get grants to support your research program. So one of the ways that you can kind of demonstrate that you know how to do that is by having already done that. So as a grad student, you probably won't really have any experience in that, but as a postdoc, there are opportunities that you can pursue where you actually bring in grants as a postdoc to support research. So that's what I meant in cash or in kind, where you can win like equipment grants, or in my field, where you can apply to get supercomputer access at one of the large government computers. And I think any of those is showing that you have some history of being able to put together a good like application and convince people that your research is important and get them to support it. Grants funding networks is more like what this was supposed to mean is more if you worked at like DOE or DOD, NASA, or something like that, then you have some knowledge about what are the priorities that those organizations really have, and that's going to be an advantage for when you're doing grants as well. Like if you worked at Department of Energy, let's say, then you might have an easier time getting grants from Department of Energy after you become a faculty, just because you have insider knowledge about how that organization works. So that's what I meant when I said grants funding networks. So again, those last 2 bullet points are the areas where already having a postdoc is very helpful. And those were the areas that, I'm kind of, someone asked before about, well, what is it like when you don't do a postdoc? Those are the areas where you really have to play catch up in, right? So you don't have the history of research support, you don't have the grants funding networks, but you are competing with people who already have those type of things. And like you're not going to be like judged at a lower level. Like you're going to be judged at the same standard as those people who already have histories in these areas and already have experience in these areas. The other thing that is really important that you will have to make some writing statements. So you would generally have to write a research statement, a teaching statement, and some universities require diversity and mentoring statements. Examples of all of these things are generally given. You can find them generally online. For example, I gave a link here to some of these things from the Cornell website. There's also Purdue University has a lot of this. University of California, Berkeley has a lot of this. Carnegie Mellon University has a lot of this. There are a lot of resources for writing these statements online. Um, I wanted to put some emphasis on some things that you should put in a research statement. So if you're looking for a faculty job in STEM at a Research One university, then the research statement is probably in some sense the most important. So I just wanted to make sure you had some basic idea about this, just leaving this talk. And what you might probably want to do is identify a few research projects that you want to tackle as a faculty and discuss your synergy of your projects with past and ongoing efforts within the department. And then again, identify government funding agencies that can help to support their work via grants and discuss plans for actually getting those grants. And then this is just some notes about the third major component, which is getting reference letters. So basically, all of these are different people that you might go to get reference letters. The last category, which is close family or close friends, is not really an appropriate choice for reference letters. I have seen that before, at least for like grad school applications. I haven't seen it for faculty applications, but it's not really that type of reference. So not any don't use any family or close friends unless they satisfy some of these other categories for reference letter writers, right? And each of these categories kind of demonstrates a different perspective of you as a scholar or researcher. So you probably want to try to find people from each perspective to write a letter of reference for you, right? So obviously your PhD advisor and your postdoc advisor are expected to write letters for you. If they don't, that would actually be kind of I would be concerned about that. Like, I would be like, why did they not get a letter from that person? That would be kind of weird. Um, Members of professional societies, for example, the Aerospace Society or the Mechanical Engineering Society, for me, people who are in those societies and have worked with you on conferences and those type of things would be a good perspective to show how active you are in the field and in the community. And you can meet these people by going to conferences, participating in conferences, etc. This is again a situation where doing a postdoc first will help you because usually you can get more involved in these professional societies after you finish your degree compared to when you're a student. Another good place is, I think, journal editors or associate editors who you've worked with in kind of the same idea. They can give a different perspective of you as a scholar and the type of contributions you make to the community. And similar to what I just said about the other, this is another situation where you probably will have more experience working with journals and reviewing for journals and editing journals as a postdoc compared to what you would have as a PhD student. Another one is if you did it in the intern or a co-op, or you worked in the industry or government for your postdoc opportunity. People from those areas who were your supervisors or co-workers can give a different perspective on your research that might be unique compared to what you typically do in the academic context. And they can also give a different perspective of your style of work, your work ethic, etc. And then any context that you have for university community outreach, that could be a good reference letter, particularly thinking about maybe the diversity and mentoring statement. This could be something that could really end up backing up your diversity and mentoring statement if you have done outreach in the community around your university, around your city, around the country, or etc. And again, it's not necessarily entirely forbidden to get family or close friends. In fact, a lot of people get letters from people they consider to be friends, but they're within the paradigm of satisfying one of those other categories. And that's what makes it a legitimate or good reference letter. So I would try to get references from multiple of these different categories to show different perspectives of my background. I think that was the last one in this section. Yeah. So, is there any questions about that? This is just like the content that goes on the application and generally what you should prepare for STEAM.
In your experience, what was the most challenging aspect of applying for a faculty position?
Yeah, that's a good question. What's the most challenging aspect? I think there's a lot of uncertainty when you write these statements about what needs to go in here. Um, right. So you can find a lot of general advice, just like I'm giving you general advice here. Um, but ultimately, different institutions will look for and require different things. Um, and they'll each require a different level of detail, maybe a different level of detail within each of the different categories. So I would say that was kind of the most nervous thing to me about this entire project is just getting these statements together. Um, yeah. So if you can find someone to help you with the statement, someone who's like your PhD advisor or your postdoc advisor to help you work through these things, who's seen these before to kind of give advice. That'll be very helpful. Um, if you know someone who is even at the university or the department that you're applying to, um, not necessarily on the search committee or anything, but just who's there and knows the general cultural aspects and that type of thing, they could also give you some hints or guidelines about which aspects should be more emphasized, which aspects can be less emphasized, etc.
I had a quick question. Could you
Right.
speak more about the interview process, or is that coming later?
Oh yeah, I didn't really write much about the actual interviews, right? So I just
Mhm.
talked about the application. Yeah, so that's a good point. So how this is typically done is that after you kind of pass through with these writing statements and such thing, you will be invited to the campus. You give a talk about your research, a seminar style talk, like an hour long, basically, and then you spend the rest of the day just meeting various faculty from the department and talking to them, that type of thing. Um, so in terms of your research talk, I mean, if you're a PhD student, you'll have your PhD thesis, which is a very similar format. So that's or your PhD defense, which is a very similar format. So that's basically what you should do is just take your PhD defense and add a couple of these type of things that would be relevant to a statement, the different statements that you have written into the PhD defense presentation. Maybe just one or two extra slides to discuss these type of things. That'll be good. And then for your talks with faculty, you just want to uh, go around and just try to learn about what's going on in the department and just generally just be curious and interested about what's happening there, and yeah, just give a good impression about you as a colleague, someone that they would like to work with. You know that you're not like a mean person, and that you are also someone who is like intellectually curious about the different ongoings in the university. Is Do you have anything else, or was that enough, or do you
No,
have
that
something
that
more specific?
yeah, that was good. I was gonna ask you, uh, so what were some of the non-negotiables you went into, like the interview process, thinking, or just like if the university operated in this way, that was a no for me, or the university operated in this format, so that was a yes for me. So what like confirmation did you get when you was in the process and speaking to different professors in the department that you applied for?
Okay, that's very interesting. Hmm. So I think this is going towards some of the stuff that I'm planning to talk about a bit later. So maybe
Oh,
can you
sorry.
ask that again
I got
later?
you. I got
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
Oh, also, I guess it might be next because how many of the schools did you apply for?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't want to bias you guys. So because I was in one
Okay.
of those special programs, I didn't have to apply to very many schools. So I'll just tell you what I understand to be a more average number, which is like several dozen.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. So it's very very competitive out there to be able to find those type of positions. So if you are eligible for one of those special programs, then that will obviously help you kind of shortcut your way through this type of thing. So my thing was just I just applied to like one of those special programs, and then I was actually planning to just go do a postdoc. I wasn't even really planning to apply to faculty jobs yet, but I got a positive response on that special program that I applied to. Well, obviously it was Virginia Tech, but I'm at Virginia Tech. I got a positive response to that special program that I applied to. So that was it. But that was just that was just being at the right place at the right time, I guess you could say. Okay. So any other just questions about like the application itself, like the written documents that you have to prepare for the application? All right, so we've gone through the last section, which was kind of like you're at your first job offer, which might be more in line with some of the things that you were just asking, maybe. Um, so, what are the things that you would want to negotiate in general? Um, well, if you're negotiating, you might want to talk about your personnel support. That is like graduate student GRA hours or GA semesters, teaching assistant semesters, postdoc, and research staff. So your people that will actually do the research and getting support for those things. You obviously need your equipment to do the research. Different people need more or less equipment. As a computational person, I don't need a lot of equipment or not very expensive equipment. Some instrumentalists might need extremely expensive equipment and facilities. So that amount varies. You want to negotiate to a certain degree your salary, although sometimes that's kind of standardized at a lot of universities, and how much summer salary support you'll get in the sense that academic salaries are kind of weird in that you're paid for 9 months and then you kind of get the other 3 months on your own. But as part of your negotiation for your job, you can get temporary support for some of your summer salary. Your teaching schedule and your teaching release schedule. So, how many courses do you have to teach per year? When do you teach? Not necessarily exact times, but like what semesters that you would teach those courses, and then if and when you can get a teaching release, particularly when you're first starting, so that you have time to actually start up your research group compared to just only teaching. Then you can ask some questions about faculty mentoring and development. So, what programming do they have to develop you as a faculty so that you can have success according to all of the metrics? And grants writing, submission, and support. So, what support do they have for you to actually write and submit the grants? So, Virginia Tech, for example, generally I write the grant, and there's someone else who basically computes the budgets and like actually submits the grant for you. Some universities I've seen where people actually do everything themselves. They write it themselves, they compute the budget themselves, they submit it themselves, and they're responsible personally for making sure that everything is compliant with all the regulations. So at Virginia Tech, I don't necessarily have to do that. We have staff here who are reading the request for proposals and making sure that everything is compliant with the budget and the font size for the grant for the proposal and all of those types of things. Okay. And your goals as an early stage faculty are pretty clear. I mean, you want to publish a journal article, particularly with your new institutions. So these are things that you probably want to just do as soon as possible. Um, So publish a journal article with your new institution. Better if you can publish it with your own students or postdocs. So it's always good to publish more, but in some sense, it's even better to publish at your current institution where you're a professor. And it's even more better if that publication is actually students and postdocs for that institution that are publishing the journal. You want to win a grant, and in that case, you can pursue opportunities that specifically target early career faculty. Like the Department of Defense has something called Young Investigator Program. National Science Foundation has the Career Program. Um, Department of Energy also has a career program. So opportunities like that to where you're winning a grant, but you're only having to compete against other young investigators. You're not competing against people with 30 years of experience in the field. And something that you probably want to do fairly early on is join a committee inside of your professional society, like AIAA, ASME, etc., um, to establish yourself for what you're doing. Okay. So I think that's it for this one. And then I talked about, so this last section is just a lot of like random things that I want you to keep track of, I guess. So the last section is life and work balance, I called it. And you have to kind of prioritize which of these things are important, health, which you can manage with physical activity, exercise, and also stress management, your relationships with other people, your family, friends, etc. And one thing that I wanted to point out to you guys also is get started early with your retirement program. The compounding interest is amazing. Well, I guess if you have a 401k, it's not really compounding interest, but it behaves in a similar manner. Anyway, compounding interest is amazing. So definitely maximize your contribution matching. Most universities will match your 401k or your 403b. That means that if you put in like a certain amount of money, they'll put in the same amount. So you're like doubling your effort. And for PhDs, postdocs, you usually don't have a 401k or 403b, but you can still get started early by putting money into something like an IRA or something to get that interest, right? So you're not going to be working forever. You need to have a life outside of that, right? So part of that is realizing that you're not going to work forever. Eventually, you might want to retire and being prepared for that. Part of that is making sure that you're taking care of yourself to ensure that you actually get to that time of retirement. And part of it is maintaining your relationships to make sure that you can actually enjoy that time of retirement. So I think that's probably the last slide that I had here. So I think this part was really more about making sure that I think if I renamed this section, I think it would be more like making sure that you take care of yourself in your faculty job offer, which includes both negotiating your job for success and also things like your work-life balance. I think if I had to retitle this section, I might call it something like that. Okay. Yeah, so that's the end of that section.
We have
So
two questions here on the chat.
yeah,
The
so
first one asks you how many journal conference papers would you consider to be good enough? I assume to get a faculty position. Is the number of citation also more important?
yeah, that's a good question. So it's a good question, and it cannot be answered concretely because it's going to depend on your field specifically. So some fields inherently have more journal publications, inherently have more citations than others. Some fields have fewer citations and very few journals or very few outlets for publication. So it's really going to definitely depend a lot. Yeah, that's probably the best that I could say. More is better, obviously, but what you're comparing your more against is entirely dependent very specifically on like the micro field that you're in. So I can't answer that generally. Okay. I do see the second question. How difficult is it to get tenure? Is it always possible to get tenure at the first university you start, or is it more common to switch university to get a tenured position? How early can one get tenure? Okay. Yeah, so getting tenure. All right, so there are a couple of ways of interpreting this. Um, so after you start your first job, a lot of people will usually like to start a so-called tenure track job. And in that case, the process of getting tenure is already kind of baked in, which is generally this type of diagram. So if you start off in a teaching track or a research track and you try to convert it towards tenure, then that's a bit more complicated. And I can't really speak to that right now. So I'll just talk about this mainline track where you were hired directly into a tenure track position. So yeah, usually, like we were saying here, it takes 4 to 10 years. It depends on if you are staying at that same university for your entire path, or if you switch universities. It's very common to switch. It's also very common to stay. Um, so neither one of them is really particularly good or particularly bad, that type of thing. Um, the process of doing it is that, well, basically, the process of doing it is, if you go back to that slide that talked about the CV, you're generally going to want to hit a lot of those same metrics from your CV that I talked about for the application, but just at a much higher level. So publications in journals, peer-reviewed journals, conference works, research grants, dollars, number of students that are graduated, all of those type of things. And then your standing in the community, which is affected by being involved in committees on professional societies. And all of those things in the end will actually be reflected by a reference letter. So when you get tenure, you will basically apply for it like you're applying for a new job or a promotion. That's really what you're applying for. You get your references together, and you want to have references that reflect all those different categories, like I talked about before, but this time for your work as an assistant professor, as opposed to your work as a PhD or as a postdoc. So yeah, if you start off in a tenure track position, then it should be possible for you to get tenure after the appropriate number of years have gone by, assuming that you've met that standard of excellence in terms of all of those metrics that we talked about before: publications, research, graduate student, and etc. And usually it's about 5 years to process. Some people go up early, which is why I put 4 as the lower bound here. Some people take a little bit longer, again, especially if you transfer universities. You might take a bit longer just because you have to reestablish yourself at that new university before you're allowed to apply for tenure. Did that address the question? Okay, yeah, great, great. Oh, there's another question. Uh, I want to go back to something that one of the people, before I get this next question in the chat, I want to go back to something that one of the people said earlier by voice. I see your picture here. Yeah,
Yeah, Joe.
Joseph.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. So, what was your question again? Has it been answered?
No, so I was gonna ask you, I had a question just now. I was gonna ask you, how was your first year overall? And then the question I asked you before talked about, um, as far as confirmation, like, okay, Virginia Tech provided me with these resources. This is why I accepted the offer to actually become a professor here. And like before you even started the interview process, were there things in your mind that you thought, well, you thought you needed at a university to help you become like to reach your future goals as a professor?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a really good question. So I would say, as a grad student, I was very not knowledgeable about what is necessary.
Mm,
So I tried to get some advice from, my PhD advisor and other people who are new in
mhm,
terms of negotiating for these type of things. But really, it was kind of like made up because I didn't have any experience doing those type of things, right? So I was negotiating kind of based on what someone else said that I should negotiate on almost. So that's unfortunate, but that is some aspect of how it works.
mhm,
Um, yeah. So in terms of what I knew that I needed, well, it's very clear. It's very clear that you need, everything in all of these categories. I think as a grad student or as a first timer, you might not just be certain of like how much of each of these things you need,
mhm,
or um, like it's not even amounts necessarily. It can also be like type of thing inside of each category that also is really important. Just as a made up example, right? Even though GRAs and GTAs both support your students to be able to work with you and engage in research, most people would consider a GRA to be better because the students don't have to do any teaching work. They can only work on your research, whereas they have a GTA, they have to split your time between research and teaching, right? So if you're negotiating this the first time, you might just think, oh, I have a lot of support from my students. My students have full support. Um, but, um, understanding the different types of support that are possible and which ones are better than other ones is kind of a subtlety aspect of it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. John, for being with us here today. I think it was really engaging. Thank you all the grad students for joining and leaving all these nice questions for him. We need to be respectful of everyone's time. So if you have any more questions, would like to chat with him, please feel free to email us or email him directly. Thank you all.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone.